All right, I don't have a lot of time, so let's see if we can get through this. I'm not here to whine about the way my candidate is being treated unfairly. Full disclosure, Andrew Yang. I'm here to try to make the point that democracy relies on an informed electorate and maybe convince you that we don't have that or that we're losing that, perhaps in a very protracted way, but definitely faster than we'd like to think. So, who do you rely on for your information, your news? How you've got to vote. You have to put your ideas back into society. How how do you know how to steer the ship? Is it a news program? Is it a website? Whoever it is, they're wrong. They they may not intend to be wrong. They may have the best intentions, but when you consider just for a moment nobody's perfect, then you know that there are going to be mistakes along the way. They're either going to be misinformed or be deliberately misinforming, and they're going to be guided by their intentions, whether they want to be or not. It's impossible to be completely objective. I try, I know I fail, and I keep an eye out for it. That's hopefully how I improve. And not just you, you may rely on a specific source or a collection of sources, but everyone you know also does something similar. They get their information from somewhere. And I'm sure you know someone who's to the left of you, and you also know someone who's to the right of you, probably lots of people in either direction. And if you can't think of people on both sides, then you're part of the problem because you're an extremist. Sorry to let you down. Um, on the left, we've got MSNBC, arguably CNN. I can't really think of too many left wing news sources. PBS, not PBS so much, but NPR will sometimes go, you can hear that liberal media bias there sometimes. Most of the time, I have trouble hearing it, but there are times it crops up. To the right, obviously Fox News and Breitbart and OAN, which anyway, let's just move on from that. If you're getting your sources from someone who is deliberately biased, who has a message of the day, who is trying to influence your thinking, trying to get you on their side, then you need to know that. Otherwise, you're not going to have any defense against it. You're just going to think, oh, they're telling me the truth, and you're going to make your decisions based off that. You need to be skeptical of what you believe and what other people are telling you. Even someone you trust is not going to get it right every time. Even someone you trust, in your own personal life, you may have someone that you communicate with regularly. And you know that when you're telling them a piece of information, you're telling them for a reason. You want them either to make a better informed decision, well, definitely that, but you also tend to want them to come to the same conclusions that you have. So when you're presenting the information, you're going to present it in a way that better represents your conclusion rather than just bald facts. And people do that to you too. I'm sure you see it all the time. If you don't, you need to look out for it because, actually, I've got a used car that I think would be perfect for you. Moving on. We all also have our ideologies. We tend to look at things through perspective of our ideologies. I have trouble thinking of liberal ideology examples sometimes. The big one for conservatives is big government is bad government, which doesn't really take into consideration um, what would be small enough, what would be too big. It's a tricky question, but if you try to put everything under that, then you're going to run into problems. And I know, well, identity politics, intersectionality are a big problem on the left, but I think that's more extreme than common ideology, although it is creeping in. And if you identify yourself as a liberal, then it's kind of your responsibility to push back against the far left. We also run into narratives. When we're told a story, we're just very susceptible to stories. It's, why mythology endures, why we like to go to the movies, why we like a good book. So when we have a media, a news source presenting us a narrative, we will either completely reject it or we will be swept along. That tends, there's obviously skepticism can be there, but we tend to go with the narrative from people that we trust more, or reject it outright. It goes back to ideology. So if someone presents you with a fact, but it doesn't identify with your ideology, it is the the round peg in the square hole kind of situation. So when you're confronted with something that doesn't fit into your ideology, you either have to reject it outright or reinterpret it in a way that fits with your ideology. And when you do that, you may be losing the actual fact and taking it perhaps out of context. But if you reinterpret facts in a way so as to conform to your bias, then you're not informing yourself. You're just digging the hole that you're in a little bit deeper. Even facts, I've studied some epistemology, philosophy, the whole question of what is knowledge, what is fact, and I couldn't give you a solid definition right now. There's some out there, but the best ones are a little bit wishy-washy because they rely on some sort of consensus, either evidence, but it gets a little bit tricky. But for the most part, in everyday life, we can look at something and say, this is black or close enough to black that we can call it black, or this is dangerous. We just have expectations that are in line with reality. But when we are presented news and information, we can't always identify what is a fact. What's being represented as fact might not be a fact. It might be a conclusion that is an opinion, and it can sometimes be difficult to tell. Most recent case, the assassination of his name's Soleimani. When I first heard about this, I didn't know what to think. I don't trust our president, but at the same time, it's possible that he did the right thing. A stopped clock is right twice a day. But the more I look at it, the more I think he did the wrong thing. It's just a matter of how wrong it is. But again, what is the fact? We have a few facts of the matter that we can agree on what happened there, and without getting sidetracked into what those are, I'm just using this as an example that there are certain facts and then there are opinions that seem to be facts. So we need to worry about that. I already mentioned motives. When someone's telling us something, they tend to be telling us for a reason, and we tell people things for a reason. I'm not going to tell you that it's cloudy today, or that it's rainy, that it's probably going to rain later, unless, well, that could just be small talk. But more often than not, I'm thinking this could affect decisions that we'll be making later on, and we are informing those decisions by sharing this information. We tend to have a motive for why we say things. I know a lot of people that just can't stop talking. I seem to be one of them right now. Let's move on. The media, the news organizations, have been recognized as the fourth estate of government, like the fourth branch of government. The idea, again, being that we need an informed electorate to make, for democracy to work so that we can make good decisions. And we are relying on this fourth institution, independent of the government, but definitely part of it. The idea of the fourth estate also incorporates the idea that these news organizations will be coloring the politics. It's unavoidable. And in some cases, it's deliberate. I think Randolph Hearst had a pretty good reputation for that. And if you look at Fox News, Do they present a slanted news? If you look at MSNBC, do they present a slanted news? I think it's pretty hard to deny that they do. And if you can't see that, I don't know if I can help you. I don't know if anyone can help you. If you can't be skeptical of the things that you believe in, then you can't improve your perspective. You can only solidify it or make it worse. You need to look for where you're wrong so you can be more right. But the fourth estate, the media, the news organizations, as part of this fourth branch of government, they have a responsibility to the American public, to the public at large, not just the American public. This is known as journalism or journalistic integrity. We need to make those informed decisions, so we need good information. And if you're trying to steer us, either for our own good or for your own benefit, then you are not doing us a service. We are familiar with the idea of if it bleeds, it leads, and man bites dog is a more interesting story than dog bites man. And we are part of the problem because we are susceptible to what is exciting or interesting. That which is interesting is more interesting than that which is not interesting. It's a tautology, and when you're sharing information, are you going to share something that's interesting, or are you going to share something that's not interesting? And the truth quality doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter as much. You're more likely to share that John said he saw Bigfoot than you are to share that, I don't know, the baldest fact that, the latest Supreme Court ruling on something that nobody cares about. It's not interesting, so you're not going to share it. Even if you come across that information, it's really more interesting that John thought he saw Bigfoot. So that which is interesting gets shared just in general. You see this on Facebook. That which is interesting tends to get shared more than that which is not interesting, regardless of truth. Outright lie, but interesting, more likely to get shared than bald-faced truth, absolute fact, undisputable, and even important, but kind of boring, not going to get shared. The news organizations will sometimes fall back on the idea that they are entertainment organizations and not news organizations. And when they do that, we need to call them out on it. They should have their press credentials revoked if that's their stance, if that is their priority. Certainly, they need to stay in business. But if they're going to call themselves the press, then they need to abide by standards of journalistic integrity. Do you see that very often? No, I mean, there's definitely some reporters and investigative reporters out there that do a good job. And it's the ones that are looking for corruption that are doing us the most good, but also tend to be the most ignored and are less likely to get a job at a big organization. Matt Taibbi at Rolling Stone is probably the best counterexample of this. And even Jon Stewart, when he was on The Daily Show, he was a comedian, but he was probably the most trustworthy news source in the nation those last few years, well, maybe more than that, but while he was on The Daily Show. Supposed to be a comedy show, but it was the most honest and informative as well of anything similar to the news. One thing, I'll show my bias here again for my favorite candidate, Andrew Yang. Recent report from PBS is discrediting Andrew as not being viable as a presidential candidate. There's a problem, and it goes back to the diffusion of innovation and information, and you tend to have early adopters, and then once you have a pretty solid block of early adopters, then something is more likely to be taken on by a larger segment of the general population until it's actually accepted as the norm. And saying that a presidential candidate is not viable when they are growing, when they have started from behind and may still be behind in the polls, but are growing at a higher rate, and when I say growing, I mean both in terms of fundraising and number of supporters, whether you want to look at that as people who say I'm for Yang or people who donate to the campaign. The growth is there, and one of the problems that a candidate has is whether or not people. One of the biggest arguments I hear against Andrew Yang is, yeah, but he can't win. So it's like you're almost admitting he's the best choice, but he can't win. And the difficulty I have in arguing against that is because the deck is stacked, both because people are saying that he can't win and because the primary selection process in 2016, it was very clearly not fair. Uh, Woe to anyone against going up against Clinton. And it just, I don't know how you could conclude otherwise. And while the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, has said that they have reformed and are going to, keep the playing field level, that isn't necessarily what we're seeing. Maybe, but maybe not. And then when it comes actual time for primaries and selection and delegates and superdelegates, I think it's going to be even more clear that there have been deals that have been made and will be made that are going to have a strong influence on the outcome of the primaries. And the only way to get past that is to focus on who is the best choice and give them your support vocally and financially. And right now, Bernie's doing very well, so he might take it and would not break my heart, although I'd be a little bit sad to see my guy come in second. So basically, by saying that someone can't win, you are part of the problem. It's a claim that can't be known, and by saying it, you are making the playing field a little less level. Let's move on from that. Let's see. Journalism should be unbiased, but not just unbiased. I mean, like I said, you can't be completely unbiased, but you need to try to be. You need to try to be objective. You need to question your own motives. You need to question your sources and their motives. You need to treat everything skeptically, which if you do that just right, if you do that perfectly, you will never make any statement, because you will know that anything you say is always going to have some caveat to it that makes it less than perfectly true. So you need to say something. You need to allow yourself to be wrong, but you also need to test yourself to try to approximate the truth as best you can. And questioning your own motives and your sources, that's your responsibility as a journalist. And even if you are working for a big organization and they want things to go a certain way, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to keep your job? You need to pay your bills. You might have kids. So are you going to do what you're told? Or are you going to focus on journalistic integrity? And when you have a company that doesn't promote a culture of journalism, but instead promotes a corporate culture, especially if you've got one of these message of the day media outlets that's definitely pushing politics rather than reporting on it, then that's going to be a problem. You're not going to get people that want to be honest being honest. You might get people that are wanting to be honest not being honest, But if the culture of the news outlet doesn't put journalism first, puts profit first, or puts agenda first, then that's just hurting America. That's my whole point here. We're trying to have an informed electorate, and if we either don't trust the electorate with the truth, or we have an agenda that we want to get the public on our side, then that's not democracy. I'm not sure exactly what you would call it, but it's not what we should have. It's not democracy. In a republic, ideally, what you have is you have an electorate that's informed enough that they can choose leaders who will inform themselves and be honest and inform the public and make decisions on our behalf. But I don't think we have that, and I think most of you know that as well, because Congress is like has one of the lowest favorability ratings of anything in the country. And the problem is we're electing people because we don't have better choices. We tend to vote lesser of two evils. We either think the Democrats are going to ruin this country, or we think the Republicans are going to ruin this country. And there are arguments to be made on either side. So when you have someone who wants to deal with facts, then rather than ideology, someone who's not going to prop up their party's push, but rather look at things on a case-by-case basis, then, I don't even know where I'm going with this. But that person can't get elected. The party isn't going to support them. And, without party support, without funding, it's hard to get anywhere. So it's interesting that we have someone now who is not supported by the party, who has a entirely grassroots. Well, we have two candidates like this, at least two grassroots campaigns that are pushing them into the national spotlight. So that gives me hope, but we don't see this so much in congressional districts. Let's worry about that another time. Let's worry about the overarching theme here is, do we have an informed electorate? Recently, unbiased journal, MS. Let me show you what I'm going by here. I'm trying to get through all of this, and we're pretty much down to here now. So, I wanted to bring up again the Yang media blackout, because this is an example of you not being informed deliberately. I don't know how we can argue that it's not deliberately. This is Vocal.media, The Swamp, put together by Scott Santens. And I'm just going to start a scroll here, give you an idea how long this is. This is examples of primarily MSNBC. I'm not sure if it's exclusively them or if it's all the media organizations. Examples of exclusionary tactics, which, given the propensity of evidence, I don't know how you could come to any conclusion other than it's deliberate. Let's see, what do we have right here? Okay, sheesh, everyone. Enough with the outrage machine. We've heard you, because you couldn't fit him on the graphic, obviously. So here we have Andrew Yang being left out of the graphic when clearly there's room. And most of these graphics, is there one that's handy? There's one that's 6. I'm sorry. Was he even on that one? I'm getting distracted. Beto O'Rourke at 1%. I believe Andrew Yang was at 2% at this time. 3%. And they put Beto O'Rourke on there instead. Yeah, and Beto O'Rourke was getting a lot of coverage even a month after he had dropped out. Let's continue the scroll. We're about halfway through. So I'm going to say, a deliberate attempt by MSNBC to underinform the public, to exclude the candidate Andrew Yang from the selection process. And the last entry here is November 26th, which was going up to the think that was right after the November debate. So we don't have. Scott has done a really good job of putting this together. I wish he'd update it because there are more examples. The most recent one is actually from CNBC, where this is just hilarious. We've got, I've forgotten his name. This is not Andrew Yang, but he is named Yang, and he's a venture capitalist in California, I believe. So there is some similarity, but how did CNBC get this wrong? I don't know. And they also excluded Tulsi Gabbard by putting Kirsten Gillibrand's picture up here. Is it Kirsten or Kristen? I'm not sure. Who has been out of the race for quite some time. So a deliberate attempt. Well, again, we don't know where CSNBC got this. We will probably never know. Was it sent over by MSNBC? Was this a deliberate attempt to misinform the public? Or it's hard to say. This could just be comedy, but two anti-establishment candidates are the only ones they got wrong. That's a little bit suspicious to me. At one point, Andrew said that he wouldn't go back on NBC unless they made some concessions and an apology. If they would agree to treat him the way they treat other candidates. They never did, and he went back on anyway because I don't remember what it was. There was something coming up. I think it was the end of the year fundraising. So we went on with Chris Hayes, and it was a fairly hostile interview. It was kind of interesting to watch. It's just like, whoa, that is not the Chris Hayes that I normally see. But, questions were asked. They were fairly legitimate, and Andrew handled them well. So we shouldn't worry too much about it. But it just plays into the narrative that MSNBC does not want you to like Andrew Yang or to even know he exists. Let's move on. I should also point out that it may be obvious, MSNBC and CNBC are both owned by NBCUniversal and Comcast. Now, if we wanted to get into a conspiracy theory, as a large corporation, Comcast would be paying more in taxes via value-added tax, as well as the possibility of increased regulation under a Yang administration. But that's a little bit too conspiratorial to really go out on that plank. We do need to consider, though, that we have a political establishment and we have a financial establishment, an economy in the United States. And we have knowns and we have unknowns. With our establishment candidates, they are at least somewhat, if not a lot, beholden to the Democratic Party. If they can't get the support of the Democratic Party, they're going to lose their seat. They're going to lose their job. They're going to lose their influence, their power. They'll probably still go out and make money, giving speeches and that kind of thing. But it is not in a candidate's best interest to work against the wishes of the DNC. We can assume, if we want, that the DNC is a benevolent oligarchy, that there are people that are in power that have our best interest at heart, or they could have their own interest at heart and that of the organization in maintaining the power that they have. And part of that is going to be their relationships with media outlets and access to candidates and getting support during elections. And there's an old idea where if you let me pick the two candidates who are going to run against each other, I don't care who wins. And you see this a lot where when you've got two candidates running against each other, they will get financial support from shared donors. Like, let's say Comcast, and I don't know if this is true. Just for the sake of making this point, Comcast will donate to the Trump campaign, and they will donate to whoever the DNC puts up, and maybe even in equal amounts. Not because they care who wins, even though they might, but because they want influence with that candidate once they take office, with the party that supports that candidate once they take office. Does that sound like a conspiracy, or does that just sound like something that is, of course it's true? I hope it's pretty obvious that even if that's not their intent, which if they're donating to both sides, how could it not be? It's the effect is there whether the intent is there or not. Let's see. We talked a little bit about establishment versus non-establishment candidates. When we look at Tulsi Gabbard, most notably Tulsi Gabbard, Andrew Yang, and Bernie Sanders, they tend to work on their own conscience, on their own belief, rather than just pulling on the rope with the rest of the party, holding the party line and promoting that ideology. I can't say that Bernie Sanders is not ideological. I can't say that Tulsi Gabbard is not ideological. And I'm sure to some degree Andrew Yang is as well, although I don't see it. It's got to be there. Thinking is just too hard not to rely on ideology some of the time. But when we have these candidates, these non-establishment candidates or anti-establishment candidates, they are not as appealing to the party, whether it's the RNC or the DNC, because the party has less influence over them. And they aren't necessarily going to get the candidate to do what they want. So they're probably more interested in someone who supports the party ideology. Again, is it a conspiracy? Or is it just something that's so obviously that's how it works that we have to accept that that's the way it is? And when I say accept, I just mean in the sense of believe. We don't have to accept that we're going to have a political party telling our candidates what to do. We need some independence between the candidate and the party. Otherwise, we have puppets, and we don't want that, right? I hope not. But then again, we don't want someone who's a complete loose cannon either, and having trouble thinking of any current examples, if you'll take my sarcasm. Let's also take Ohio. Oh yeah, this should also bring up that recently Ohio, Andrew Yang was not able to get on the ballot for the primary election. The reason being, they needed, I believe it was 1,000 signatures on petitions to be submitted by a certain date, and so instead of 1,000, they submitted 3,000. That's not the problem. The problem is that these petition forms need basically a cover sheet, just like your TPS reports, that is a declaration of intent from the candidate saying that they are running for president, or whatever the petition is for, a declaration of intent. And I believe this is not just for presidential candidates, but any petition. And so the people that were collecting these signatures, were collecting the signatures, and I don't think, I doubt there were even 1% of people that didn't know what they were signing. I want Andrew Yang on the primary ballot. But during this collection process, the cover sheets were removed from what is described as a vast majority, or a vast majority of the signatures were considered not viable because the cover sheet was missing. So even though there were 3,000 signatures, 3 times as many as were needed, there were enough that were not viable petitions because the cover sheet was missing, that he did not make the 1,000 votes or 1,000 signatures. So he can still win the primary in Ohio or place in the primary in Ohio, but only through a write-in campaign. Now, this is one of those things where the person in charge of accepting or rejecting these petitions had a choice. They could either follow the letter of the law or the spirit of the law, which to me seems like it would be we want to make sure that the people are not being defrauded, that petitions are only gathered under candid circumstances where people know what they are signing for, what they're agreeing to support. And was that the case? And I have to think it's obvious that it was the case, that there were more than 1,000 people supplying their signatures to get Andrew Yang on the ballot. But then, and then also, if we conclude that that was the case, that this was not fraud committed on the people of Ohio, what is in the interest of the people? And I'm sorry. And who is, and what is the best way to represent the people? Sorry about that. And in this case, it's a hard call, because who was harmed in this decision? 3,000 people who signed a petition were ignored, versus the state of Ohio ends up with an extra candidate on their primary election ballot. What is the lesser evil here? I don't know. But the person in charge, if we assume the best of him, chose to follow the letter of the law and protect the people of Ohio from having an extra candidate on the primary election ballot. Maybe he did the right thing. Obviously, I'm biased, but it seems like voters were suppressed. I'll let you make your own conclusion. And again, like I said, maybe he did the right thing by following the letter of the law. Let's move on to polls. Now, for a long time, polls have been a problem because, in part, the way they're conducted, who commissions them, and what information is weighted. Recently, we've had a problem because typically this time of year, there are fewer polls following because of the holiday season. And there was a window for candidates to achieve certain metrics in polls to qualify for the Democratic debate here in January, which is, I think, about a week away. And tomorrow, the 10th, is the last day for qualifying polls to post their numbers. But there just haven't been very many polls. In fairness to the DNC, they made their announcement, I believe it was early last year, when the qualifying windows were, what the percentages would be, and they have not veered from that. So, we could give them some credit there. But it's a little suspicious that there haven't been any polls conducted. I don't know what their actual position is. It's a little bit difficult to research this. But one statement from the DNC was that the DNC does not conduct polling or does not commission polls during the primary process. And I can see why that might be a good choice, because if they are conducting the poll, the pollster is getting paid by them, then there is the question of influence. If the DNC has a particular candidate that they want to see do well in the polls, could there be some sort of backroom deal? I kind of doubt that's it, but that could be a good anti-corruption motive for the DNC not commissioning polls. But at the same time, there haven't been any polls or enough polls of the sort that would allow for qualification for the debate. And is this deliberate? Is it just, well, that's how it worked out? Another problem is the presidential impeachment. There was a lot of national polling that focused on that because that's what news organizations were more interested in. So if presidential candidate preference was polled, it tended to be towards the end of those polls, which can be long. And so there's going to be perhaps insufficient evidence to release a statistically significant poll, if they even ask the questions. So typically there's a dry spell during the holidays. The presidential impeachment changed the demand for information. It changed the idea of what people want to know, although I could argue that the people themselves didn't care as much about the public opinion on impeachment as they did about who's going to be in the next debate. That's my opinion. Excuse me. A little dry. So a lack of polls has led to my favorite candidate not being included in the next debate. Tomorrow's the last day. There may be polls early. There's one poll that is probably going, that is going to be released tomorrow. And so that may be enough for him to qualify, but I'm not sure that it is. He doesn't need to. The talk is that he doesn't need this debate to win the primaries, but it would certainly help because every time people hear him speak, he always picks up more people and he always picks up more donations. That's so he would not be hurt by being on the debate stage. So there's a commission. Yeah, who commissions the polls? That can be a problem. If you've studied statistics at all, you know that it is impossible, it's nearly impossible to avoid biases in your polls, the way questions are asked. If you know anything about mentalism, you know what priming is. So the way the information is presented for the question tends to influence the answers of the people. And a good pollster will try to minimize that as much as possible. But we always have to question, how was the poll conducted? A bigger problem is that when you see these polls, you need to pay attention to see whether or not they are weighted, a weighted poll. And this tends to be, they're looking for probable voters, or likely voters. And this tends to be people who have voted in the last election. So if you have someone who's never voted before, if you have someone who is a disaffected voter who stayed home in previous polls because they've kind of given up or they weren't inspired by any candidates, but now they are inspired, either as a first-time or disaffected voter, now you cannot keep them away from the polls because they have found something or someone they believe in. They are less likely to be counted as a likely voter, which is kind of weird. It makes sense if if we think someone hasn't voted in the past, so we think that they're not likely to vote in this upcoming election. That's a fairly flaccid argument. It's very flawed. It's definitely incomplete, and it does not take into consideration enthusiasm. And a lot of these polls will ask about enthusiasm, but I don't think that ends up weighting the poll at all. It's my belief that if you're going to release a weighted poll, that you should be obligated to also release the raw data. What about unlikely voters? I think we would see something substantially different. We would either see Bernie much farther ahead than he is. I'm confident we would see Andrew Yang at probably maybe twice his current polling numbers, which, what are his current polling numbers? Because there hasn't been, I think one or two, well, qualifying polls. There's only been one since November, I believe it is. But if we look at the raw numbers, if we consider enthusiastic voters as likely voters, I think we would be seeing different numbers. And just looking at the raw numbers, that would help us understand what the weighted numbers mean. And by not releasing these numbers, I think, again, since this is part of the voting process, the candidate selection process, I believe this is another form of voter suppression. Even if it's unintentional, even if it's well-intentioned, especially in today's day and age, this polling structure is based on old ideas, television and newsprint, prior to the internet. I think we could be doing a better job. So when we look at all of these things, the way the media conducts itself, which is entertainment over journalism, we look at the DNC, who prioritizes and endorses or pushes candidates who are establishment, who are beholden to the ideology of the party, and not just the ideology, but just obedient to the party in some degree or another, versus anti-establishment, who say this party is not this is my party, this is the closest thing we've got to representation of the American people, but it's not doing a good job of representing the American people and the interest thereof. These anti-establishment candidates are going to get less support from, I'm recapping here, are going to get less support from the party, and because of the relationship between the party and the media, the anti-establishment candidates are less likely to get the support and coverage from the media as well. And we look at the polls, weighted polls tend to favor establishment candidates as well. People who tend to vote for establishment candidates tend to vote for who they see on TV. And as we just discussed, you're more likely to get an establishment candidate for a variety of reasons in front of the American people, and the low information voter is more likely going to vote for an establishment candidate. I think there are a lot of people who couldn't name 4 Democratic presidential candidates. And when you have that case, you're likely only going to have them support one of them, and possibly out of very disinformed or misinformed or underinformed, obviously underinformed ideas. So maybe it's not a conspiracy. Maybe that's not the intent. Maybe there's no cabal of people deliberately saying we're going to take control of the country and ignore the will of the people or the interest of the people, and we're going to make ourselves more powerful and richer. Maybe that's not what's happening. Maybe they're not out there saying that, but that is the effect of what they're doing. There's plenty of room for comments down there if you disagree with me on any one point or my general thesis. But, good timing. I need to go to work in 1 minute, so I'm going to wrap it up. I'm T-Ray. This is Third Rail. And, YouTube stuff. Leave a like, comment, dislike, subscribe. Tell me what you'd like to see, or what opinions you'd like expressed. And we'll get back to you. Thanks for watching.